You are about to watch part 5 of the Beach Boys here on Pop Goes the 60s. The failure to produce Smile in 1967 did irreparable damage to the Beach Boys' reputation, and specifically to Brian Wilson, who simply could not live up to the title of genius that he was saddled with. The notion that they had missed getting on the counterculture bus was confirmed by their cancellation of the Monterey Pop Festival. And let's face it, symphonic rock was not going to be the wave of the future, and the Beach Boys started getting overshadowed by new bands like The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Now, making the most of a bad situation, the Beach Boys, who were not able to complete the Smile album, went into Brian's home studio to record kind of a lo-fi version or a stripped-down version of Smile called Smiley Smile. Recording for Smiley Smile began in June of 1967 after the Monterey Pop Festival. According to Carl, Brian had said this about Smile. He said, "I can't do this. We're going to make a homespun version of it instead. We're just going to take it easy, and I'm going to get in the pool and sing. Or let's go in the gym and do our parts." That was Smiley Smile. Now, although Brian had an 8-track machine in his home studio, it wasn't all decked out like the normal studios they recorded at. So this made things much simpler for the Beach Boys, and they were able to record quickly and efficiently. Now, these 3 songs are the only ones independent of the Smile project, and that last one, called Getting Hungry, is a super weird song, and oddly enough, it was released as a single, but under the names of Brian Wilson and Mike Love, and it was not credited to the band on the single anyway. And this is strange because it kind of goes against the narrative that Mike Love was against uncommercial music, as we often see in the Smile narrative.
You're with me tonight, I know you're with me tonight. From my window, those are my wind chimes. Together the forest when God reached softly and
Those 4 songs are re-recorded Smile tracks. Some are extremely different, especially songs like Wonderful. And the song Fall Breaks and Back to Winter, Woody Woodpecker Symphony, that instrumental was really part of the Fire tape from Smile. But this version is much less demonic. I don't want to say it's happier, but it's just re-recorded. It has a completely different feel. Vegetables was re-recorded for this album, and the band only took 5 weeks to record this entire thing. Now, they play on all the instruments on this record except for on Good Vibrations and on most of Heroes and Villains. And unfortunately, the adulation they got from Good Vibrations the prior fall completely evaporated by the time this album was released almost a year later. Now, this album still uses some of the chanting styles that they used on Smile, and it overall sounds very united. There's a modular approach to this, so maybe the band totally bought into it by this time. And generally, this sounds pretty united as a group. And the focus is where it should be, on the vocals. With Smiley Smile in the can, the band decided to mix a little business with pleasure. They were going to do a concert in Hawaii and record it for a potential live album. Now, this was done in August 25th and 26th of 1967. This was the first appearance after they had canceled the Monterey show. So they took their families, and I think they just kind of needed a break. The problem was they weren't very well rehearsed, and Brian was actually playing live with them, and he played Baldwin organ.
I may not always love you, but long as there are stars above you, you never need to doubt it. I'll make you so sure.
Now, for this one-off engagement, they did a collection of their hits, but they also did selections from Smiley Smile. Some of the members were under the influence of LSD during the concert, so this was not deemed suitable for use. So what they did instead was go back into the studio to cut kind of a quasi-live version instead of doing it actually live.
I get by with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends.
One song they attempted live was The Letter, which was a current hit by the Box Tops, and you just heard the Beatles cover with a little help from my friends, which sounds great. But this is the album that they were supposed to come out with here, Lei'd In Hawaii. but nothing ever came out. And this is an album that never was that I have done, and I'll give you a little more information on this later. But the tracks that they had done, or the songs that they recorded both in the studio and live, were actually a very wide selection of songs. It's too bad they weren't able to make it happen. Thankfully, Smiley Smile was already in the can, and that was released in September of 1967. And it reached number 41 on the chart, which is respectable, but all their prior albums had hit the top 10, so this was a big disappointment, although it charted pretty well in the UK at number 9. It was the first album to be produced by the Beach Boys, which is notable because Brian Wilson had started taking a step back from the production duties. Now, the reviews for Smiley Smile were largely negative. It had been a year and 4 months since the prior album, which was Pet Sounds, and people had great expectations. So let's read some of the reviews here. Journalist Nick Kent said Smiley Smile appeared like the single most underwhelming musical statement of the 60s. It was a major disappointment for fans, many of whom expected a work similar to Pet Sounds and the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. Now, according to Scott Schneider, the LP was released to general incomprehension. UK's Melody Maker wrote, undoubtedly the worst album ever released by the Beach Boys. Their prestige has been seriously damaged. Now that comes from the UK, who was very supportive of the Beach Boys during this time. Now, while Smile may have divided the Beach Boys fans, had it been released, Smiley Smile merely baffled them. Biographer Keith Badman writes that the music press responded by effectively blacklisting the band, refusing to review their latest records or reviewing them long after they had been released. Now, an example of that is this next review, which is actually a positive review by Esquire's critic Robert Christgau, who said, he praised the minimalism of Smiley Smile, characterizing the record as slight, and calling the deliberately uncommercial sound of the album unique and almost perfect. That's kind of a backhanded compliment. I would say it's not a wholly positive review, but that came out 8 months after the album was released. So Badman was suggesting that, hey, people were eventually reviewing it, but it was already off the charts by the time the reviews went. So that's not really how to review new albums. So that's an example of them slighting the Beach Boys in the review process. Record Mirror's Wesley Lane predicted Smiley Smile would probably go to the top of the LP charts. He felt it contained better songs on the whole than Pet Sounds, and that it falls into a current psychedelic bag without being blatantly acidy. So I would say that's true. Smiley Smile does sound of 1967, but it's not using the production techniques or the fads that were becoming so popular in psychedelic music. So I would say today it's basically considered like a lo-fi type of album. But if you accept that, that's fine. But I think really the basis for comparison really should be on the vocals, which on this album are still very good. High quality, and the Beach Boys totally deliver. Now, favorable reviews about the Beach Boys were few and far between at this time, and they couldn't rely on the favorable British press anymore like they used to. And Jimi Hendrix made a comment that didn't help. He was talking about the single Heroes and Villains, saying, in Disc and Music Echo, I don't particularly like the Beach Boys. It makes me think of a psychedelic barbershop quartet. This is not the kind of press that they wanted. Now, with the cancellation of Lei'd In Hawaii, the band started working on their next album very quickly, and that was Wild Honey. Now, despite this turn of events, the Smile project was not completely dead, and you'll see this throughout, really up to this very day. So if you look at the first album that they released on Brother Records, this is their own label, this catalog number was number 9001, the very first release. Wild Honey was slated to be 9003 on Brother Records. So there's some speculation that the 9002 catalog number was reserved for the eventual release of Smile. Obviously, Smile did not happen, and Wild Honey was released in December of '67. So they were starting to record a lot of stuff. Here they had basically 3 albums recorded in the space of like 4 months, one of which, the live album, was unreleased. In this album, everybody's contributing and writing like a band. Brian Wilson and Mike Love reestablished the writing partnership on this album and come up with 2 very strong singles. Wild Honey and Darling are two examples of why this album is called their R&B album. And it seemed like the Beach Boys were doing everything to stay away from these psychedelic trends and trying to get, back to basics.
My heart was breaking till you started making me feel like a natural man. You say that you've been a long time needing me, and don't you know that there's so much more to come? I was made to love her, build my world all around her. Hey, hey, yes.
This Stevie Wonder track, it rocks, it rolls, and they totally kill it. So I think this was a very good move for them. And it makes me wonder if they maybe should have done like a Motown album.
Let the wind blow. Eat a lot, sleep a lot, brush 'em like crazy. Run a lot, do a lot.
Now we're going to start seeing pieces of Smile appear in all these subsequent albums throughout the end of the 60s, and Mama Says is a perfect example of that. That was a snippet from Vegetables that went unused and used as the closing track here on Wild Honey. Now Bruce Johnston recalled that we wanted to be a band again. The whole Smile thing had wiped everyone out and we wanted to play together again. As Carl said, Wild Honey was very simple music to cool out by. Brian was still very spaced out, though I seem to recall he had given up acid by that time. Wild Honey was released exactly 2 months after Smiley Smile, and this is a common practice Capitol was doing with the Beach Boys, crowding releases, much like the Greatest Hits Volume 1 came out 7 weeks after Pet Sounds. Now the cover of this album, this graphic, is actually a photograph from a stained glass window in Brian's house. Now this charted at number 24 and 7 in the UK, so it charted all right. And it's a very fun album with the band supplying almost all the instrumentation and composition, leaving very little room for pretension. Despite the quality of this album, the reputation preceded them, and they got a kind of a nasty review in Rolling Stone, if you can believe it, and it went like this. It's kind of amusing that the Beach Boys are suddenly rediscovering rhythm and blues 5 years after the Beatles and Stones had brought it all back home. So this review came on the heels of a slightly change in their look. The Beach Boys actually wore the striped shirts all through the year of 1967. So in early 68, they finally made a change, but they made a change to matching white suits. They kind of made them look a little more Vegas-y. It wasn't really in step with the counterculture still, so that was still an issue. But one thing they did do that was kind of in step with everything else, and that was dealing with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And they met with him in Paris, and Mike Love had accepted an invitation to join the Maharishi and the Beatles in Rishikesh. They started working on their next album in February of 1968, Friends. Now, Mike Love was busy with the Beatles, so he missed the first couple of weeks of recording this. And this album is pretty much composed all by band members, co-writing with one another.
Wake the world with a brand new morning. Say hello to another fine morning. There's a baby, yes, there's a baby about to be born. Annalie, Annalie the healer. Healer. We've been friends now for so many years. We've been together.
Now, Friends was the title track, and it was released as the lead single from the album. And this showed the downward trend of their chart success. This one only topping out at number 47, and it only got to number 27 in the UK. But even though they were not charting well, this doesn't detract from some of the excellent songs on this album.
I had to fix a lot of things this morning, 'cause they were so scrambled.
One of the great pluses of this album is that after all these years, we finally see Dennis step out of the shadows and start to compose.
Now is the time life begins. Little bird up in a tree looked down and sang a song to me of how it began.
Mike Love's trip to India with the Beatles, studying transcendental meditation, seems to have rubbed off on some of his compositions.
Be here in the morning, be here in the evening, and get you feeling grand.
Now this album was specifically a left turn from the prior album, and they did kind of a slight return to Brian Wilson producing and using lots of session players, much like the Smile days. In fact, there are 2 instrumentals on this album that harken back to the Pet Sounds era, but unfortunately this album totally bombed, charting at number 126 on Billboard, their worst charting in their history. Now, one thing I'll mention about this album, this is another example of their album covers not being very good, and Mike Love even remembers Paul McCartney suggesting to him in India, hey, you guys got to take better control of your album covers and your art direction. So this album is, I don't get this band pictures or this drawing is very strange looking. I don't think it really does much for them. I think the back cover is much nicer, actually. Now, Bruce Johnson said that Friends came out just after Hendrix and Cream. The whole country had discovered drugs, discovered words, discovered Marshall amplifiers, and here comes this feather floating through a wall of noise. So this album was different than a lot of the psychedelic stuff going on in the louder rock, but it was still very Beach Boys. Now, the band had just recorded about 4 albums of material within the last year, so they had kicked it into high gear, and they were ready to get back on the road with kind of a new look and a new feel. And to do this, they hired a backing band, an 8-piece backing band, and this next tour was all self-promoted, so they did all the underwriting. They were handling the tour themselves. This tour had Strawberry Alarm Clock and the Buffalo Springfield supporting them. And the tour was supposed to start in Nashville. So the day they landed in Nashville was the day Martin Luther King got shot in Memphis. So they were ready to play at the venue and they just sent everybody home. So this canceled several of the shows on the tour. Of the shows that weren't canceled or postponed, the ones that did happen were very poorly attended. So the assassination of King, that filtered through the South. Everybody was just in shock and nobody was really in the mood for music. And this was a huge financial loss for the band. Now, hoping to recoup their losses on this tour, they planned another tour, and taking Mike Love's lead, they had figured to incorporate the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi into their tours to give lectures. So the idea was the Beach Boys would do like a 45-minute set, there'd be an intermission, and then the Maharishi would come on and do a lecture. Well, this is not what concert goers wanted, and after 3 days they had to cancel this whole thing because it just wasn't working out. Now, this goes to show you that although the Beach Boys were kind of getting into the right counterculture stuff, the Beatles had just essentially disavowed the Maharishi by leaving Rishikesh early, and there was some bad press for the Beatles around this as well, a little bit of an embarrassment. But the Beach Boys just show time and time again how their PR is always poorly timed. So less than 2 months after releasing this album, which didn't do well, Capitol released the Greatest Hits, but that album fared even worse than this one. 1968 proved to be a really rough year for the band, and although the Transcendental Meditation helped a lot of the band members, including Brian Wilson, Wilson didn't stick with it very long, and in addition to pot and amphetamine, he now added cocaine, which he was introduced to by Danny Hutton. And Hutton noticed that Brian started getting suicidal during this time, and I don't know if it was the cocaine or what, but it wasn't long after this that Brian was admitted to a mental institution. None of the fans really knew this at the time. This was kept from the fans, and the story was that Brian was still kind of the mastermind behind the Beach Boys, though that couldn't be further from the truth. Now the band had more money going out than coming in, and the band's personal finances were also exposed and vulnerable. And they had Brother Records at the time, and they were adding artists to the roster, and this was also draining their resources. So they had 2 particular artists of note. The first one was Redwood, which eventually became Three Dog Night, and the second one was Charles Manson. Now, Capitol was a little desperate for sales as well, and they released this compilation called Stack of Tracks. Now, this is an album of instrumental tracks by the Beach Boys. So essentially, the vocals have been removed, and it's just the instrumental backing track. So it's kind of like a karaoke album. And Brian Wilson approved of this. He thought this was more like the party album from late 1965, early 66. But I think this is crazy because the Beach Boys were a vocal band. Maybe you'd do an album with just a cappella vocals, because the instrumentation, they didn't do a lot of it anyway. So it was a very strange release, but as I said, Capitol was desperate, the band was desperate. Kind of an interesting release. They've got the chords on the inner gatefold here, and it comes with a booklet with a lot of the music on it. So it's kind of interesting, but this album nobody was interested in at the time, and it didn't even chart at all. Needing a hit badly, Brian and Mike banged out a song that was reminiscent of the old days called Do It Again. Do It Again was a moderate hit in the United States and hit #1 in the UK, so this temporarily got them back on track. But one person that started to come off track in the band was Dennis Wilson. Now, Dennis had gotten divorced in mid-1968, and of all the band members, he probably had the most abandon and the least discipline. He was a drinker, he had discovered LSD, and his sexual escapades were legendary. Around the summer of 1968, Dennis picked up a couple of hitchhikers, 2 hippie chicks that he had seen a week later and picked them up another time. Took them back to his place, left and came back, and who was there but a guy named Charles Manson, who kissed Dennis's feet when he met him. Now this began somewhat of a friendship between the two, and Manson started to move into Dennis's house. And also who moved in with Manson were this group of mostly women who acted like servants to Manson. Dennis started bringing Manson to parties in the Hollywood scene. Now, Manson had been around a while. He had been in San Francisco prior to this and had been involved in the free clinic there where they were given like LSD and amphetamine. And there's a whole backstory to this, but Manson had been around a long time. He was already in his mid-30s by this time and had a long history of crime. He even raped a boy at knife point in the 50s. So this guy was bad news and should not have been on the streets. But this is another story. I'm not going to get too much off track here. But at this time when he entered the LA scene, he did so as somewhat of a musician. He wanted to get a record deal. And some of his songs Dennis liked, even Neil Young liked his songs. So what did Dennis do? But he brought him to Brian's studio, in his home studio. And of course, when Charles Manson comes along, so does his entourage. So Brian never liked Manson. Brian's wife surely didn't like Manson. So Terry Melcher was introduced. He was the Byrds producer, and he was considering maybe doing some demos of Manson. So this is how Dennis started to get Manson involved in some of the community here in some of the recordings. Dennis was quoted in the Rave magazine. This came out later in May of 1969. He said that when asked if anything's ever scared him, Dennis replied, "Sometimes the wizard frightens me. Charlie Manson is another friend of mine who says he is God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry, and may be another artist for Brother Records." Now, Dennis was very loose with his money, and Manson took total advantage of this. And the Beach Boys accountant started to take notice and say, where's all this money going? What's going on here? So they started doing background checks on Manson. That's when some of this stuff started to come out. At least they were looking after their clients and saw his criminal background. And it is thought that about $100,000 of Dennis's money, credit card spending, and assets, including cars, were spent by the Manson family. Now, the Beach Boys actually recorded one of Manson's songs. It originally was titled Cease to Exist, and this was on the next album. But Dennis changed it quite a bit and became Never Learn Not to Love.
Cease to resist. Come say you love me. Give up.
Charles Manson was never credited on this record, and he was very upset with Dennis changing the lyrics. And Dennis didn't feel that he owed him anything because of the money that Manson had spent and stolen from him essentially. And by this time, Dennis was afraid of Manson. A lot of people were afraid of this guy, and for obvious reasons. And he had confided, this gets very dark, he confided to Terry Melcher and to Mike Love that, and this is Dennis speaking to them, he had said that he had seen Charles Manson cut a black guy in half with an M16 rifle and shove his body down a well. Now, this has not really been confirmed, but this freaked Dennis out so much he couldn't even go to the authorities. So I don't even know if that's true, but Melcher confirmed that Manson had killed people before. So this is how, and so far as I know, these people were not going to the authorities either. They just didn't want to deal with this guy, and they didn't want to believe it. So things came to a head. Dennis Wilson walked away from this house. The Manson family destroyed it. And when Manson figured out that Dennis wasn't going to back him anymore, he sent a bullet to Dennis through, I think, one of Dennis's housemaids or something, and was basically threatening Dennis to kill him. And Van Dyke Parks, who must have witnessed something, said that once Dennis was threatened that he beat up Charles Manson. So this was getting very crazy, and the Beach Boys, and Dennis in particular, just washed their hands of this guy. And they ended up moving to their next residence, which was the Spahn Ranch. With Brian in the psychiatric ward in the hospital during some of the recording of this album, the band did many of the recordings without Brian's participation. And this came out in February of '69. Now, Do It Again was added to this album, and they released 2 other singles from it. Now, despite Dennis's troubles, he was still growing as an artist and contributed some very good songs to this record.
Going out tonight, you put your real cool looking clothes on. Come let the power through ya. Come on and let me thrill ya, mama now.
Despite missing many of the sessions, Brian did contribute these 2 excellent pieces.
They watered the lawn.
I Went to Sleep was a co-write by Brian and Carl, and Time to Get Alone, which had been started sometime before, was finished off, and I think is one of Brian's best pieces. I think it's a minor masterpiece. What makes this album somewhat special is 2 of the Smile tracks that were originally unissued were added to this, Our Prayer and Cabinescence. Now, they did extra work on Cabinescence to finish it off for this album, whetting the appetite for Smile fans out there. I think 2020 is one of their strongest albums, probably one of my favorites of the late 60s period, and probably the best work since Smile. I guess there's 2 Smile tracks on here, so that kind of elevates its quality quite a bit. Now, from this point forward, Brian was not really working with the band as much. He could only handle a couple songs per album, and he wasn't the driving force he once was. That track you just heard was an uncompleted track from the 2020 sessions, and all the other band members now, aside from Brian, really had to start contributing because Brian wasn't able to write as much as he used to. Now, once Brian was left the hospital, a lot of the production and a lot of the band leadership fell to Carl. 1969 picked up where 1968 left off, and that's with a lot of high drama. And one of the things that happened that was not good for band dynamics is that Dennis started having an affair with Mike Love's wife. So this ended up in Mike and his wife getting divorced. Another thing that was an issue was Bruce Johnston. He was not contributing as much the last couple albums, and the band was looking to replace him with Billy Hinchy. Now, Billy Hinchy was from the group Dino, Desi, and Billy. And he was very known to the band. He had sang on a couple of albums before. His sister, Annie, was married to Carl Wilson. So when the Beach Boys added people to their inner circle, oftentimes they'd like to keep it in the family. Billy Hinchy declined the invitation to join the band, as he was still in his own band doing some stuff, but he was also a full-time student at UCLA. And Bruce Johnston was unaware of this at the time, but they just continued with him in the band. In April of 1969, the Beach Boys again filed suit against Capitol. This was for unpaid royalties in the amount of $2 million. Now, they were fully intended on bringing back their brother record label, and Capitol was saying, well, wait, we still would like to sign you, and why don't you deliver another album to us? There was a contract for them to do one more album anyway, so Capitol didn't quite want to lose the Beach Boys yet. Since Brian couldn't continue on his 1965 to 1967 pace, the other band members had to start writing more songs. So they did that and started to assemble tracks for the next album.
I'm going your way, can I give you a ride? I always knew our paths would coincide. Didn't wait too long, baby. Didn't wait too long. Didn't wait too long. Making me worry and wonder, where is she? Where is she?
These songs are from a batch of new songs they had been working on for a proposed album called Reverberation. Now, this album, they had done dozens of tracks, and they had one more album to deliver to Capitol. but they didn't deliver it. And what happened was Capitol ended up discontinuing their back catalog and cutting off all the royalties because the contract lapsed, and this left the band even in worse financial straits. The Beach Boys had very lack attention to this contract issue. I think they thought they could just get signed by anybody, but their manager, Nick Rillo, was having trouble getting anybody interested in the Beach Boys. And this was due partly to Brian Wilson's behavior. Word had gotten out about some of his eccentricities. He wasn't producing like he used to, and people in the record industry, they knew he was the main guy, and if he wasn't able to produce, then labels were not interested. So making matters worse, Brian told Disc and Music Echo in the UK that their grim financial situation may force them to file for bankruptcy. Now this was a disaster for him to say this publicly, and this scared even more record labels away. Despite the lack of interest in the United States, they still felt that the European base was strong enough they could sign with a label there. But once Brian made these financial statements about bankruptcy, Deutsche Grammophon and Polydor were totally scared away from signing. Despite all this going on, in a bizarre turn of events, the next single was co-written by Brian and his father. Poor chart action in the United States only saw this single getting to number 63, though it hit pretty well in the UK. But there were still things going on that weren't working well for the band. Brian ended up opening up a health store called the Radiant Radish. And while he was doing that, the band was touring, but some of the shows were so poorly attended that they were only in the hundreds, and many shows had to be canceled. Now, by late 1969, the Manson murders had hit the news, and after a month or two, the Beach Boys were connected kind of tangentially, and this gave them just more bad PR that they didn't need. Throughout 1969, the Beach Boys had planned to buy back Sea of Tunes, which was the band's catalog of songs. And this was jointly owned by Brian Wilson and his father, Murray. But the financial situation was so bad at this time that Murray ended up selling the entire catalog for $700,000 to Irving Music. Now, Brian was not consulted on this. It appears that Murray actually forged his signature to make this happen. So after all this time, their own father, or in this case, Mike Love's uncle as well, sold out to a different company, and the boys weren't going to have control over their songs at all. Now, part of the reason Murray was doing this, because he felt that Brian was incompetent mentally, and he was, he was an alcoholic, and he was taking drugs and wasn't competent to handle a deal. Meanwhile, Mike Love, remember Mike Love back in '65 trying to get some publishing? Here he is now totally screwed, so he's not represented legally on anything. So this began a long legal battle that took decades to sort out. One other problem with the original agreement is Brian Wilson and Mike Love, they were underage anyway, so there was some question of the legality of all this. But this was an absolute mess. So if you think the Beatles had it bad, man, Yoko Ono is nothing compared to this. So the Beach Boys have no record label, they've lost all their songs, and they're completely dejected. Mike Love ends up going on this fast, a 3-week fast of just juice and water and yogurt apparently to cleanse himself of the toxins. And this backfired on him, and he ended up getting pulled over by the cops and handcuffed because he was acting all goofy because the toxins were getting to him. And he wound up in a straitjacket in a mental institute for a couple of days before they realized what was really going on. So he missed some tour dates, and Brian had to sub for him. So this was just the ramifications of the sale of the songs really hit the band hard. And who could they trust if they can't trust their own family? Thankfully, help arrived in the form of an old friend, good old Van Dyke Parks. Now, Parks was working as an executive for Warner Brothers, and he was instrumental in getting the band signed to their subsidiary Reprise. Now, the people at Warner Brothers were Beach Boy fans. They were big fans of Brian Wilson's work. So this, I don't know why this didn't happen sooner, but it happened now, I think, with the instigation of Van Dyke Parks. So one of the things that Warner Brothers wanted, they wanted to make sure Brian was involved in the recording. And there was also a stipulation that Smile would be completed. And the band was given a $50,000 advance to deliver Smile, although this was unbeknownst to the public. Now, despite having a lot of songs in the can, the Beach Boys did offer some tracks to Warner Brothers for their next album. And eventually the album was retitled Sunflower. That was going by that title. But Warner's rejected it. And in 1970, in February, they submitted a second album of tracks, and Warner Brothers rejected that as well and sent them back to the drawing board. But they did release one song as a single.
And they got music for you there to add some music.
Add Some Music to Your Day. It was a very good song, but it again charted poorly. And it did a little bit better in Cashbox, which suggested that the sales of the song were better than they were getting airplay of their stuff. And it wasn't released in the UK, but the next single that was released bombed in the States and did really well in the UK, and that was Cotton Fields.
In them, cotton fields back home.
So a third version of Sunflower was submitted to Warner Brothers, and they finally accepted it, and that's this album that you see here. Now it's got a very family-friendly cover with band members with their kids around. This was shot at Dean Martin's Hidden Valley Ranch.
I'm a singing, love to sing, I love to sing it from my heart. Oh, the creation. It's like incense and flowers. I wanna make them part of our sweet love.
Now those two tracks are Brian's contributions to the album, the second one being a co-write with Al and Carl. But the real strength of this album are Dennis's tracks.
Now can you see what has come over me? For my life is growing like I love the way you move. You make me feel like a man. You know you make me feel like a man. I'm a singing, love to sing, I love to sing it from my heart. Oh, the creation.
That last song was a co-write with Al and Carl. And the great thing about these Dennis songs is that he's injecting a lot of rock and a lot of soul into these vocals, which is not something you hear a lot when you think about the Beach Boys. But he would save his best song for a ballad called Forever.
Could fill your heart with joy, I'd sing forever.
The continued democratic approach yielded two Bruce Johnston songs.
The trouble you had, it wasn't so bad. Those tears, I know they're just a warning, reminding me.
Tears in the Morning was a poor choice for a single, and a better choice might have been the Mike and Brian song, All I Want to Do. So the Carl-produced Cool Cool Water was one of the highlights of this album, and Warner Brothers really wanted it on there. So after they finished, they realized that they had a very good album on their hands, and Carl called this our truest group effort. So expectations were high, but when the album was released, nobody bought it. It tanked at 151 in the US charts. It did hit number 29 in the UK, but they were really trying to break into the US market again here, and they were so disappointed that it didn't do well. Now this is one of the band's, considered to be one of the band's best albums of the late 60s, early 70s, and despite the bad sales, it got decent enough reviews, but people were still not into the Beach Boys. Now, one of the things that you'll notice on some of these albums is, I'm going to show you the album label here, that the Beach Boys, the Reprise label is kind of married to the Brother Records logo. Unfortunately, all the goodwill going into this album by the record label just didn't translate to sales. And Brian thought that the image was still an issue, and he said in a July interview in 1970 that the thing is, we haven't done enough to change our image. We sort of operate a democracy thing in our productions. Maybe that's the problem. I don't know. And here's what Mike Love said. While the group's democratic approach allowed the rest of us to grow musically, we would never replicate our past success. So manager Fred Vale, who had very much belief in them, even when the band didn't believe in themselves anymore, he said, just stay the course. This is going to be fine. This is a very good album. But they ended up firing him, and they hired DJ turned musical advisor Jack Riley. Now, Jack Riley met the group through, I think he met Brian in the Radiant Radish health food store. And as a DJ, he interviewed some of the band members, I think, on an earlier, maybe on the album before. But they hired him as a manager because he seemed to really have a pulse on what was needed. So the first thing he did when he was hired is he said, no more matching white suits. He made Carl the leader on stage and in the producer's chair. They were invited by Van Dyke Parks to go to the Big Sur Folk Festival. Now this is a very big event, and with Chris Christopherson and Joan Baez, and they did really well there. He also got them booked at Carnegie Hall, so that was a huge success. So things started to change here for the Beach Boys. Even the rock press started to get back on their side after a show they did at Fillmore East supporting the Grateful Dead. After the release of Sunflower, band engineer Stephen Desper assembled tracks for a follow-up album tentatively called Landlocked. Now Warner Brothers heard these songs and said, hey guys, go back to the drawing board. Now these songs were, as you know, we had the Reverberation album. There was so many tracks that they had recorded during this period. This is another of my albums that never was, Landlocked. This actually wasn't turned in as a full album under this name to Warner Brothers, but they had so many tracks, they have enough for another whole unreleased album, which is kind of interesting.
Cashmere hills filled with evergreens flowing from the clouds down to meet the sea. I knew I'd found my peace solution. Wouldn't it be nice to live again? Have you ever been in an airplane? Up above the clouds, there's no rain.
The problem with these songs that were submitted is they sound a little bit too like the late 60s Beach Boys, and Jack Riley suggested that they update their sound a little bit more. I think Warner Brothers was thinking the same thing. So they went back to the drawing board and started recording more tracks. And one of the tracks that they started with, Jack Riley asked Brian, hey, can we use the song Surf's Up? Surf's Up was one of the main songs from the Smile project, and Brian finally gave his okay to do that.
Unmelted, overtaken me, dim chandelier awakened me to a song dissolved.
The inclusion of Surf's Up breathed new life into this project, and it became the title track, replacing Landlocked. And Jack Riley was what you would call a hands-on manager. Not only did this guy start choosing material for the album, but he also started writing for the album and started to sing with the band.
Don't go near the water. Don't you think it's sad?
I've been leaning on my back like a free train off a track, trying to find.
Let my soul automatically soar, but I hit hard at the battle that's confronting me. Open doors and clear stars, that's what I like. Oh.
Carl submits probably his strongest song called Feel Flows. Though the long-awaited Surf's Up is the centerpiece of this project, this Brian Wilson song nearly steals the show.
I'm a leaf on a windy day. Pretty soon I'll be blown.
This is one of Brian's finest moments and considered by many to be his final masterpiece. Unfortunately, due to some of the inner band squabbles at the time, Dennis ended up pulling his songs from this album, and that left room for cringy songs like this.
For years my limbs stretched to.
Released in 1971, Surf's Up was a big hit compared to Sunflower, charting at number 29 in the US. The reviews for this album really weren't that different from Sunflower, but apparently Jack Riley's image makeover totally worked.
There's a new album from the Beach Boys. It's called Surf's Up. The Beach Boys' last album, Sunflower, was critically acclaimed as the best in their 10-year career. Now comes Surf's Up, which is even better.
Hit hard at the battle.
Surf's Up, newest from the group that long ago left water and sand for dry land, where they could enrich American music with their melodies, harmonies, and lyrics.
So here's the cover to Surf's Up with this famous painting on it. Now, they had a lot of help on this album with Brian's wife Marilyn and her sister Diane helping out on vocals. The Dragons and other people chipped in instrumentally on this record. So it ended up being quite a team effort. The return to the good graces of the counterculture were cemented with their appearance on the cover of the Rolling Stone magazine in October of 1971. So these three albums never were: the Beach Boys' Lei'd In Hawaii, Reverberation, and Landlocked. I'm going to have these available to listen on my podcast, so links will be below if you'd like to check those out. So what do the Beach Boys do with their newfound success? Find out in part 6 of the Beach Boys here on Pop Goes the 60s.